that my subcommittee is a little back, a few steps back actually from our preset deadlines, but we will get there.
That'll be my fault. That's me.
Just 1/3 of the fault falls on you, Peter.
That's what I
But I'm 3
started.
hours behind everybody, so I'm kind of
Yeah,
right. So,
yeah, fine.
Okay, so I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So why don't we get started? And since we have a guest today in our meeting, let's start with the guest in case in case Erinn Collinsworth needs to leave, you are welcome to. I think everybody here has met Erinn before. Would you like maybe to give a very quick introduction of yourself, Erinn, for in case somebody doesn't haven't met you before?
I would be happy to, and I will tell you right now, I don't know if it's the Zoom, and we do Zoom all the time, so I'm not sure what the issue is, but my Outlook stuttered. I'm spinning. Elizabeth, I actually need to restart the computer. I think this is going to crash.
Okay, so if you want to get
So,
out, so restart
so
and
that's the
join
risk
us.
manager in me, preventing the future issues. Let me reboot. I'll rejoin, and I'll be on in just a minute.
Sure, not a problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's start by who can give us a little update of the work their subcommittee is doing. Monty, would you like to get started?
I would love to. Good morning, everybody. And Elizabeth, let me give you an update that will impact us all, I think, in a good way. I've had the chance to visit with Mr. Mo Madani.
Okay.
And where we were told we needed to have something ready for the middle of 2024, he has corrected that back to what we were told before. We need to be able to get something submitted to the Florida Building Commission and the folks considering all of that January of 2025. So we got our 6 months back. So some of the heat is off.
Okay.
He said they do this in a 2-step process. He's very, very helpful, very eager to answer any questions we have, and I have his contact information that I can share on my screen in just a moment. But
sure.
Basically, for the entirety of the year 2024, he said they consider what the international code has done and what part of the Florida Building Code might want to adopt some of those measures. And not until after 2024 do they consider what they call step 2. And that would be amendments from people that want to submit things to be considered to be put into the new code. And that won't be until the start of 2025 when they officially begin to look at those. They are willing to talk to us about any of those, I think, at some point in the course of the year of 2024, but they can't officially begin to consider them as a group officially until 2025.
Okay. Did you share with him, Monty, our plans and what was his reaction?
I did. I told him our concept was to submit things for consideration and inclusion into the Florida Building Code as appendices in the various codes. And I threw out Rick Logan's name. Rick gave us his contact info. He was happy to have heard that, and that the strategy that we were using was to propose appendices to the codes that could then be adopted by different authorities or local ordinances and that sort of thing if they want to, and get them into the code and get people comfortable with them. And over time, they may begin to be adopted or moved out of the appendices and into the actual code itself. He was great with that. He said people do that. That's not unusual. They don't do it all the time, but he said that's not unusual at all. So he was fine with that concept.
Great. Okay. At least we won't have any much pushback, I hope.
Yeah.
Okay.
What he did say is we need to register on their website, and I asked him, is that an individual's registration or can an organization register as a committee or something like that? And he said, I don't know, but I'll look into that and we can have further conversation about that. But when there's a registration established, we will get updates from them automatically, I guess, as they look at things, perhaps everything about the code. I don't know. Or it may just pertain to what we're proposing, but there needs to be some kind of registration. And
It's an
if,
individual registration, Monty. It's basically subscribing to get their updates. So I already get them from the Florida Building Commission, but
okay,
and then when we do comments, when it comes to commentary periods, if we do that, that is also done individually. So like Rick submits comments and a few other people have submitted comments before. So you guys could actually do it now. Let me see if I can find that link so that you do get updates. You'll get updates anytime they meet, anytime there's a deck statement request or anything like that. So it might not be bad for everybody to start getting those.
right. And I don't know if if we as a AIA Florida committee submit things to be considered, or if myself or Peter or Elizabeth or Lindsay or individuals submit those things. If they knew it was coming from AIA Florida, I think it might carry more weight.
A person has to do it, but you can put, and Rick has done this before too, you can put on behalf of AIA Florida. You can say that you are representing AIA Florida, but after we are all in agreement that that's what.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it would be stronger if we submit things as a group all together once, than pulverize our submissions.
Yeah.
Okay, so Monty, so do you mind, so that's the general introduction. Before we go into the details of your subcommittee, since Erinn is back, do you mind if we pause your presentation, go to Erinn, you'll get back to you?
Oh, not at all.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
So you are mute again, Erinn.
No. I would say that is far more important. Crystal asked me if I would be happy to participate on the committee. Just bring in that risk management, insurance, both underwriting and claims experience perspective. What I'm hearing from the industry on my end, and I am, needless to say, more than happy to participate. So for me, this is I've had some interactions with some of the changes to the building code at Becky's request over the past year or so. But on the resiliency committee, this is completely new to me. So I'm sitting back, learning, and happy to opine where needed.
Okay, thank you. So can you, I don't know if you are at a point that you're ready for that, Erinn. Is there anything you are hearing on your end regarding standard practices and expectations from the insurance industry?
What's on the radar right now coming out of Florida statute were the changes to the building code following Surfside, and then the corresponding changes to the condo and co-op board. In fact, it was less an architect. I had an MEP pulled into a conversation thinking they were being asked to provide a quote just to do a study. And it was, they could have gotten themselves in quite deep on a condo conversion project that they really wanted nothing to do with. That is very much on the radar. The resiliency, not so much from an underwriting perspective. Not to say it's not there, not to say that they don't care, but they're not dictating standards.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I have heard that in other parts of the country, the insurance companies are becoming savvier on that. And there is a change that the standards, the requirements of what we as architects need to do and say upfront to our clients may change, and we are expected to bring resilience measures to the clients as we develop their projects. And if we don't, then we're liable for that.
That's all standard of care. I mean, it is the same discussion one would have had when BIM was introduced. Are you keeping up? Standard of care is, the conduct that another professional with your experience, geographic background, project type, what they would be doing. If everybody in that community, shall we say, has changed the practice, that the statutes, the guidance in the building code have changed, then yeah, the standard of care in that community changes. So as an example, when you see a contract in sometimes it even gets amended in an AIA agreement when you receive it from an owner or developer, there will be a comment about the standard of care and holding yourself to that of a national firm. Well, a national firm may have very vast different experience than a firm, let's just say local to Orlando. An Orlando firm may practice differently than a firm located in Key West, just based on local codes and ordinances, not just Florida building code. So that doesn't surprise me, but I would not look at that conversation as a dichotomy or a difference to what is expected of us. That is what is happening in their region.
Thank you for clarifying, Erinn. Does anybody have a question for Erinn at this point? Anything in specific would you like to hear from the insurance end of this equation?
Erinn,
right.
I'll ask Elizabeth if
Go
you'll
on. No,
if you
please.
allow. Erinn, one of the reasons that we encouraged the outreach to you is as part of our resilience efforts. We don't want to do this in a vacuum, and your expertise regarding risk management, insurance, that sort of thing is valuable to us. So I would just ask, I mean, we've heard in the news that there are some insurance companies that are thinking of leaving Florida if they haven't already, or they plan to, and that kind of thing. We would like to hopefully have a good understanding of why, and I guess it's claims and money that they're having to spend on those claims versus the money that they're getting in premiums and that sort of thing. But if there is a way that the Florida Building Code can, over the next years, make claims not cost so much, make the claims not be as high, and the insurance industry might be interested in that, we would love to know that. And by example, I would offer this for an example. FEMA has guidelines out there regarding disaster and that sort of thing, and I think supplemental instruction in preparation for storm events and things like that. If there are some things in either that FEMA document or perhaps the California code, I'll call it, or other ordinances or guidelines that are elsewhere that the insurance industry is interested in considering for Florida, we would love to know that as well. We would like to not be just a group of architects appealing for amendment to the Florida Building Code to make our structures and our communities more resilient. We would like to go arm in arm with the insurance industries, with other associated industries, in our world that are impacted by these decisions, and go together and appeal and apply for amendment to the code in that way. So that's why we're trying to have a broader conversation here.
No, and I absolutely am following what you're saying. I think first part, half step back, I would not look at the insurance, not saying you are, but I would not look at the insurance industry as a monolithic entity or a monolithic program. Entity works. What you're hearing in the news about pulling out of Florida, are the property insurance carriers. And this is a legislative issue as much as anything. It dates back to 1992. It dates back to Hurricane Andrew. Southeast Florida bore the brunt of it for a decade. And then you look at the 2004, 2005 hurricane season, where it became readily apparent that these storms were going to hit. We always knew this, but that they could hit multiple parts of the state. We experienced a property insurance crisis. At that time, you follow the losses, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Ian last year, Idalia this year, which came in with storm surge. A lot of this is political wherewithal in Tallahassee to set adequate rate. But the underlying factor here, for the main reason these carriers are pulling out of Florida nationwide, the statistic I believe is Florida nationwide represents 7% of property claims. We represented over 90% of the litigation. You can't incur expenses of that nature and stay profitable. And you take a half step back to the political wherewithal. The way it's all been set up, Citizens carry some of the lowest rates. Theoretically speaking, they should be the highest, and any of us paying homeowners insurance premiums don't want to hear that. It's really a legislative and legal issue how these claims went through. The last two legislative sessions, there have been changes to there's been tort reform specific to property that is expected to help solve that problem, but it's going to take years for it to happen. Now, move back to what you're saying about resiliency. The invitation for carriers to come back in, it definitely goes hand in hand, but I'm not going to suggest that a property insurance carrier is going to necessarily look at the code. It may influence their underwriting, who they're willing to accept as an insured. Hurricane Michael, that image of Mexico Beach, the same thing with Hurricane Ian. Certain structures withstood the onslaught of the storm. We know there is code that we can use that's effective. Now take the economic flip side. If you talk to people in the Keys, there's a huge labor shortage because the codes that those structures that were destroyed during Hurricane Irma, the laborers can't afford to live there. So we're looking at economics, we're looking at legal, and you're looking at legislative. I think it is starting to come back, but there is an incredibly strong need for cost-effective workforce living that meets the code, so those individuals can stay in the communities that they grew up in, that they moved to, that they work in. There's a lot of gaps in it. I think what you're asking is fantastic. But if you're looking at it, I don't know that property insurers come in and analyze this like for example, I think the conversation Elizabeth and I were having was more on the professional liability, professional standard of care, and what your underwriters are looking at. I can have a carrier that writes property and a carrier that writes professional liability, and the programs are in silos. I couldn't even tell you if they talk they probably don't even talk internally amongst themselves. And if they're different, same parent company, different carriers, there's a likelihood they would bring claims against each other. So that industry, the industry is incredibly segmented. Does that make any sense or help answer the question?
Yeah, it paints a pretty good picture of the situation, and yes, that helps tremendously. I guess on a very simplistic kind of way, if your example about Mexico Beach was a good one, that one house standing. If that picture was the inverse, major storm hitting, and most of the buildings were spared because of an enforced building code that was adequate, then insurance claims would likely be less. And that might help insurance companies have some incentive to not bail on Florida, so to speak, or let them have some encouragement that they won't be guaranteed a total write-off of a claim every 3.5 years because the storm hits a certain part of the state. So that's part of our efforts here. And the second part of it is, and this is the build back and the resiliency aspect of this is not just about structures and codes. It's also about efficiency and things like that. So I don't want anyone else on the call to think we've forgotten about that, but that was part of the reason why we're talking about code and that sort of thing, so that flooding and planning for not such a vulnerability to flooding, and planning for stronger structures, and planning for, structures that can withstand a storm in a variety of ways is one of the goals of the code updates.
Into that, Citizens recently has required, and mind you, I don't write personal lines. I don't even write my own homeowners.
Right.
Citizens has recently mandated that if you are one of their insureds, you have to carry flood insurance, and this is legislative, regardless of what flood zone you're in, which should do two things. One, reduce litigation, which is a driving factor in rates and carriers pulling out, and theoretically should ensure that a damaged structure is covered by the proper policy. A homeowner's policy, a commercial property policy, flood is one of the basic exclusions because it's a product that can be purchased elsewhere. And again, some of this is legislative. These are things we could do. And I don't remember what the statistic is, but it's at least 60% of all flood claims. And that means whether it's going to an insurance carrier or through FEMA, arise in a non-flood zone. So if you're purchasing, you have a mortgage and you're required to carry flood by that, but because the mortgage is backed federally, and it's like, I'm not in a flood zone, I'm not required to carry it. It's incredible that the high percentage, the high costs that come from parts, claims that are not in a flood zone.
That's pretty amazing. Wow. So we're inviting you to the conversation, I guess. This is your first time with us. I hope it's not your last. So that's what our goal is to partner with associated industries and people with like minds regarding construction and the construction and professional services worlds, so that we propose things that are appropriate and beneficial.
I love it. I am very much into the big picture, and the details matter.
Thank you, Erinn. And if you see, as we go along, anything that calls your attention, that if it's changed from a construction standpoint that could help the final result, that be share with us, because that's what we're looking for, how we can make things better as we go along.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Erinn? So then, Monty, would you like to go back to your presentation?
All right. My subcommittee was about moisture, and I'm getting off of the the Mo Madani thing. We can go back to that if we need to, but Becky, I appreciate you. If you've sent a link, I haven't seen the chat yet. It looks like there might be some stuff in there, but I would encourage us all to register at the website, and we can talk about who makes the submittals and that sort of thing regarding who the chair of the committee is next year, and all of that. We can coordinate all of that going forward, but it looks like we have another 6 months. I'm not saying let's take it all that time if we don't need to. I like the idea of presenting some stuff to some strategic group and giving them marching orders and going forward. What we talked about in our last subcommittee meeting was really, I guess I kind of, because of what I was doing and what my thoughts were, a great deal of it had to do with that. And I did this simple thing. I went to the Florida Building Code and looked up words in the definitions like water and moisture and humidity and vapor and dew and dew point and things like that, and found none. The code in this case did not address any of that. So those of you who are on the energy subcommittee, I would encourage you to go and look for definitions of it is what you want us to be talking about. I have a PDF document, and what you're looking at right now is the spreadsheet that we were filling this out as we were talking. I think Lindsay was filling this out. And Crystal, if that's you moving the mouse around, I appreciate you doing that. They began to flesh out some of what we were talking about regarding this. And what I shared with the group was, and I'm working on a project with the state of Florida right now at the Capitol with some exterior garages. And here's an example of the use of definitions. We have for a year and a half been wrestling with condensation that is attaching itself out of the moisture in the atmosphere, is attaching itself to concrete structures in a garage, and that moisture wicks its way into the concrete and rusts the rebar. And we have for a year and a half tried to get the contractor to stop saying sweating, because the garage is not sweating. It's condensation from the atmosphere that is in the air that is clinging to the structure and absorbing itself into the concrete and attaching and affecting the reinforcing there. The moisture is not coming out, it's going in. And they have finally begun to realize that. So the words that we use as we're talking about all of this is critical. The understanding of what vapor is versus water versus some other form of moisture is critical. So I did a quick study on the internet about definitions of water and vapor and moisture and such as that, and where it might be in the codes, and found that there aren't any. The thing that really hit me was when I just did a definition of water, and you can do this yourselves if you would like. I think it was a Webster example. You know how definitions will give you uses of the word. The second example of the use of water was the statement, "There is water dripping from our ceiling." And it really hit me that the world understands, here we are looking for a definition in the use of water, and they pick an architectural failure to illustrate the use of water by saying there's water dripping from the ceiling. So what I'm proposing is, and what our subcommittee is doing, is going back and looking at other areas in the code where we need to consider the definitions. Lindsay has a great one in the code right now that is a lack. Frankly, it's a loophole. If a space is not occupied, it doesn't really have to have waterproofing and things like that around it, and you don't have to worry about moisture getting in and it's causing mold and things like that in unoccupied spaces. If you know of some specifics in the code about that, we want you to fill those in. But this this spreadsheet right here is the start of our conversation about definitions and how we use these words and why they need to be clear. When we start saying something in our appendices about water, we need to be clear what people understand what water is versus vapor versus moisture versus humidity. And those are all different forms of water, and they do different things regarding building construction. So I can get more specific and do a screen share of what I found. I think it's on the board in our shared forms. But if we need to look at those, we can. But that's it in a nutshell. That's where we are and where we're going right now in all of this. What we found was, as we talked about it, vapor or moisture, not water, but vapor or moisture regarding our subcommittee's focus, we found that it really does two things. And if any of you were there and you're still here and you want to supplement or correct me, please do. But basically, vapor or moisture does two things to the built environment. It decays it in the form of penetration and working itself into assemblies. It either rusts steel and compromises its reinforcing abilities, or it causes rot in wood given certain situations and certain humidities and certain temperatures and certain percentages of moisture there. So it decays the structures. And as regards the users, it creates unsafe conditions of mold and sick building kind of situations. So when we're looking at moisture, we found ourselves talking about it in those two ways. And as Crystal has highlighted right here, the definitions of moisture, vapor, et cetera. Down below that, identify mitigation efforts of preventing or controlling moisture in the building envelope and assemblies for those two reasons: to not let the building structure decay and to not create harmful conditions for humans with mold and that sort of thing in the interior spaces. So that's kind of where we were at this point in time.
I have a question. Other building codes, do you find that they go into the detail of the definitions?
I haven't found that. I searched and I didn't find it. There may be some that know those other codes better than I. I'm certain there are, but we have some that are looking at, and we've divided up the codes. We've been looking at Caribbean building code models, California, New York, and others, and they haven't gone there. The thing that concerned me was I drilled down as specific as I could be, and I said a building code definition of moisture. And the only source that I got to pop up came from a law firm who had determined what moisture was. And it was very limiting, and it was very, very pointed and not entirely accurate. And I did a screenshot of that and saved it. So as far as I could find, the only people that have tried to define what moisture is regarding architecture are lawyers. And I think as architects, we ought to step up and help clarify this situation.
I would be careful. I think this is similar to the conversation we had about mandating construction administration or construction contract administration a year or so ago, and how it increased the standard of care. I think to a great deal, this might be education, this might be training. I would be careful how I defined it in a statute. It then does not even become this, it could even become beyond the standard of care. It becomes a legal definition. It is a requirement. And think about contract language, compliance with codes, and you can go back to, it was not about water or moisture, but you can go back to the Broward County School Board appellate decision. If you look at their contract, they have in a paragraph the standard of care, and there is a comma or a period that then has been interpreted, and it's how I probably would have interpreted the contract myself, didn't need a court to do it, that compliance with code with strict liability. There was no practice of negligence. You had to comply, and then it flows through that contract in at least 2 different places. And the appellate decision was if Broward County School Board had intended the professional to practice the standard of care in interpreting code, they would have said so. You were supposed to be compliant with every code, and they're inherently in conflict with one another. They don't exist in a vacuum. So whether you're going state, local, there's often a lot of interpretation. I think education is a key component of what you're talking about, and bringing fellow professionals up to this standard. I don't know that you want it so clearly defined in the statute. It will be very difficult to defend. And if you're finding a law firm defining what water is, it's probably a plaintiff firm. It's unlikely that it is defense counsel.
Right, exactly. That's what concerned me when I saw that.
But you
And the
get to
thing that,
defend it. If it's not defined, you get to defend it.
well, the thing that jumped out at me, and I'll jump to the energy group, and I'm not in that subcommittee, was as we began to talk about energy in the code, are we going to define it as tons of carbon or joules or watts or calories, or what is going to be the, I guess we need to define the currency of how we expect things to be measured and what those things mean, because there's a wide band of assumption I'm going to say are understood, understanding that really is not understanding at all. There's some very vague terms out there if people let themselves not try to drill down and be clear on what they're saying and what they're talking about. Moisture and vapor and water are not the same things, I guess is what I'm saying. And I'm not saying we need to box ourselves or paint ourselves into a corner, but we ought to try to have some understanding about what it is that we think we mean. Is it moisture that's airborne versus moisture that is 3 feet deep and pooling on the ground? Those are very different things, and they react in very different ways. So I get what you're saying. I was frankly surprised that water and moisture and vapor were not listed as definitions in the building code.
All right, so we need to put that like a note and develop this conversation as we go along. We need to be careful as we propose things to make sure that they don't come back and bite us on.
Absolutely.
I'm glad we're having this conversation, so at least it's in our radar, and we need to revisit that as we go along and develop more the content of this appendix. Do you have anything else to add, Monty, or we can move on to the next subcommittee?
No, I'm happy to move on.
Great. Thank you so much. So I really appreciate your subcommittee putting the spreadsheet together, and it's very helpful to see where you are and where we can develop more. So I would say, I think Larry represents the resources subcommittee, right, Larry? Do you have any? I know that
I'm on the committee, yes.
yes. Can you just give us an update? And if you don't have any, that's fine too.
I really don't. I do see that
I think
John,
and Julian's on. I think I'm not sure if he got his audio to work, but I think he did add information. Shadia added and John added, but John and Shadia aren't able to make it. Can you hear us, Julian?
I can.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay. So between Larry and Julian, whoever wants to speak first, I'm happy.
Go ahead, Larry.
I was going to say, I'm sure you're much more eloquent on this. Again, I have to say apologies here because I I can't read the sheet very well here as to what John and Shadia were able to add to the spreadsheet so far. Crystal, can you go through some of that possibly? Maybe that's the best way to kind of touch on what, and I'm going to look separately here on it.
Let's see if I can zoom in. I know they added what they found was missing from the existing
And
building code.
I think that was, Julian, am I incorrect? And that was kind of our first step, is to try to review some other building codes and find what was missing from the Florida building code and try to populate that into the spreadsheet here, or something
Correct.
we saw.
And I think John was trying to drill down on the fact that the code has some very broad brush definitions of building, of the requirements for buildings of different types. And that's why he was talking about that those institutional, hospital and storage typologies are missing from the unique energy use profiles. And Shadia I hadn't spoken to since she added hers, so I'm not.
Yeah.
And I think she was picking up on pieces of ASHRAE 90.1, which is beyond our energy code. So there's pieces that ASHRAE's already looked at and determined which we don't have, or which haven't been adopted into the Florida building code to date. And I was looking at water and water quality. And on water, I was looking at the gaps between the Florida building code and LEED in particular. So there's a lot of water consumption reduction measures that are pretty standard practice on any, well, they're prerequisites of any LEED project. And the more LEED projects we have, the more standard they are. And they're also included in the Cal Green, for example, and other state green codes around the country. So that's to reduce consumption, which is one of the major ways we can become more resilient, is just by using less. And that extends both internally within the building with plumbing fixtures and so forth. But irrigation is also a major item, which is actually covered by the building code and is a massive use of water in many states. And I'm sure many people have seen where some states and cities are starting to mandate much lower irrigation usage on properties, and the use of irrigation fixtures, which greatly reduce consumption. And the irrigation section of the Florida Building Code basically just speaks to the plumbing pipes, how it should all be connected. They don't discuss usage whatsoever. And that's a major omission if we're trying to consume less energy and less water. And then on water quality, the more I looked into that, the more that didn't really seem to be a part of our remit, because that's covered by an awful lot of statute, which is totally outside of the building code. So I just referenced the broad brush statutes that water quality has to meet. And maybe that is mentioned in our code appendix, but otherwise I don't know that that's actually something that we should touch in a code appendix.
Julian, is there a big difference between the LEED requirements and the current code or the upcoming code requirements for water consumption?
So I'd say it's on average about 20% less through
okay.
LEED. So the LEED minimum is about 20% less on average.
Okay.
For some fixtures, it's greater than others. And there's also the requirement in LEED for all fixtures to be labeled as water sense. So that's a little bit like some of the US Department of Energy, Energy Star kind of labeling. I was going to look into why did LEED actually start that mandate, because there are fixtures out there which meet the consumption requirements but are not yet water sense labeled. So it's kind of preferring some manufacturers over others, which doesn't seem right. But I was going to look into what's the background to that, and would that impact us in any way?
Do you have any updates on the materials portion of the work?
That would be me and Stephen. I'm trying to remember Stephen's last name. I don't have any updates at the moment. I just need to get, I guess I've had some sort of paralysis on where do I start looking at items and which items. There are a lot of items that in the column there. We talked about fiberglass, rebar, and mass timber, which are good places to start. And I guess I just need to focus on some codes and start reviewing them, comparing them to the building code. I don't know how far Stephen's gotten.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Larry. So then that I reserved our subcommittee on flooding for last. We are really delinquent. I don't think we fill out much of the form yet. We had some discussions on what to do, and I'll give like a quick summary, and Peter and Polly they were in our last meeting. If you have something to add, please chime in at any minute. We use the document that Julian has so kindly shared with us that compare the building code with the California Green Code, and the summary on the code where the flood and flood resistance is located. So we decided to there is a table. I don't know if you have it handy. Oh, I shared the table last time, right, Crystal?
Yes, I was trying to look for it so I can share my screen and share.
Okay, if you find it. Anyway, so I'll continue while Crystal look for it. So there was this table, and we decided to split the table amongst ourselves and see who. And
Was it this one?
there was another table that has all the items on the building code, all the areas in the building code where flood resistance is addressed.
Okay.
Anyway, so there is a table, the famous table 1612, that's a cross-reference of defining flood-resistant provisions in the Florida Building Code. So that table is divided in building, residential, existing, mechanical, plumbing, and electric. So we divided the table, and our exercise now is to check every session on the building code where flood-resistant materials is being addressed, and identify how we can improve those sessions. That's where we stopped. We divided, and we're supposed to have our results for discussion or to share with the group today, and we didn't have a chance to move that much further. But it seems that the building code currently has a lot of information. Yes, that's the table. Thank you, Crystal. Has a lot of information on how flood needs to be dealt. And one of the things we discussed would be the base flood elevation, which in a way it's addressed on zoning codes. Each district has its own base flood elevation, but the building code makes it mandatory to build above base flood elevation. So it's not necessarily a zoning issue, it's a building issue as well, because the zoning, it's just the one that defines what this base flood elevation is, but the building code mandates that this base flood elevation needs to be followed. So we discussed about dry flood proofing, and the other discussion we had was on the floor to ceiling height of the ground floor on commercial buildings. That's something that the City of Miami Beach has been implementing. They are requiring the ground floor to ceiling height to be higher than normally one would design, to allow for future elevation of the streets, and then you elevate the ground floor and you still have a usable ground floor space in the future. And I don't know how much of that it's a building issue, it's a zoning issue. Here it's been dealt as a zoning issue, but if we could build some language regarding that on the building code, it becomes more widespread. I don't know if there is spaces, if that's something that the building code can mandate or can dictate or can suggest. Maybe being an appendix would be a suggestion. We could have a bigger impact than just depending on the local zoning officials to implement things like that.
Elizabeth, can I ask how that's being received in Miami?
I haven't heard any pushback because the way they are doing it is it's not affecting your height limitation. So developers, I mean, you spend a little bit more because you have to build a little bit more height, but you're not being penalized on what you can build. So I haven't heard any really pushbacks on that one. And especially because the city has been elevating the streets. So I think it's a clear need out there that what happens is that some streets has been raised, but the existing buildings are at street level or below street level. And that's not a very good position for buildings to be, and they cannot raise the ground floor because then they won't have the minimum ceiling to floor height. So I think there is an awareness that that's a necessary add-on to including future design.
Yeah.
So I think in a way, as long as you're not penalized, it's being well received. And the
So-
same thing we did with the base flood elevation. We have a 5-foot freeboard. So the base flood elevation buildings can go from 9+1 to 9+5. And your height start counting from your ground floor elevation. So if you go +5 to build a lot of resilience against future floods, you are still not being penalized on your total building height.
So it really results in an incremental effort to raise the city.
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah, so which is kind of an idea, and I think in a way, if you are on a flood-prone zone, if you're in a coastal area, it makes perfect sense. It's a very long-term project,
Right.
but I think we need to start somewhere, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, Peter or Polly, do you have anything to add to my kind of
I do
a
not.
presentation?
That was a pretty good recap. Thanks. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yes, I agree.
All right. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left on our meeting, so let's just go back to our marching orders. So since we are all kind of doing progress, some of us doing more progress than others, and I commend the ones that did more progress, and I'm not going to penalize the ones that didn't do that much progress. But anyway, so I think we should continue the work we are doing in our subcommittees. So the next meeting, I would appreciate if the subcommittees meet on their own and try to push the needle a little bit forward. Now that we got more time, we need to strategize how to use this additional time wisely, and hopefully we don't find next month that there is a change again and you are back to the last 6 months. So what I would like to propose, if we could meet the group as a whole again and check on progress, and at that point we will figure out the new deadlines and who will be in charge of what, because as you know, starting January 1st, Julian would be the next chair of the committee. So by next time we meet will be October, so we'll have 2 months left before the end of the year. So we need to figure out how to transition and who will be doing what. But I would, even though we had gained our 6 months back, I think the sooner we could engage this task force to the discussion, the better it will be. Especially because a lot of the people in the task force, they have more hands-on experience with the Florida Building Commission, and I think that will be very helpful to include their perspective in our conversation. But we'll discuss all that next time we meet, and in the meantime, please try to, and Crystal can help you guys setting up another meeting for the subcommittees to develop a little bit more the matrix, and we reconvene in a month from now to review what has been done and set the agenda for the upcoming month before the end of the year. How does that sound to everybody?
Sounds
Sounds
great.
Yep.
Is Erinn still with us?
Yes,
Can I ask Erinn a question?
please, Monty.
Erinn, I don't know if I misunderstood you, but as part of our discussion, you said that 7% of property claims in the nation came from Florida.
9.
Correct.
But 90% of litigation claims came from Florida.
Correct.
That's
I
astounding.
mean, it was horrible.
Right.
I mean, absolutely horrible. I mean, it's why I don't like property. And I really don't like personal lines. I love what I do, liability. I'll write commercial property for one of my clients. But when I started the insurance industry, actually came into the commercial agency on the surety, on the performance and payment bond side, 1993. So a year after Andrew, and I heard all of my father's horror stories. I mean, they had a robust personal lines business. They were writing property left and right. And Southeast Florida has never recovered after Andrew. And this is one of the things when you're asking about the insurance industry, keep in mind, as smart as these individuals are, and I'm looking at the carriers, the decision makers, they're not necessarily forward looking, and they have a tendency to serve two masters. They have an obligation to their policyholders, and there are guidelines that and third parties that review their financials, review their management. When you see a contract in the insurance requirements and you need an A15 rating, that's AM Best. That's one of the third parties to ensure that the assets are there. But the whole reason the market collapsed after Hurricane Andrew is not too different than the financial crisis in 2008 2010. They thought they were too big to fail. The state farms in all states did not purchase reinsurance, and the individual companies, it killed them. It killed them. And so the second master that they're serving are their shareholders. And it's really hard to you build your assets, but it's really hard to take a long, particularly property, to take that long-term picture and make decisions that are going to keep you solvent here. And some of what I read about what we call the takeout companies, these insolvent carriers over the past 3-4 years, I think there were executives, unethical, executives padding their pockets as well. But the legal costs are the huge factor.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking at these numbers, and I mean, Florida, there's 50 states, so Florida is 2% of the states, but we had 7% of the claims, and then 90% of the litigation claims. That's just phenomenal. I wonder if there's a place we could find out what was the trend creating so much litigation in those claims. That's probably somebody's doctoral thesis work, to find that out.
Actually, no. It was part of it is assignment of benefits. And it is post loss, whether it is a disaster or individual, the homeowner, and mind you, why I do what I do is my experience overall is that the professional liability carriers pay claims. And when something comes in front of them, rather than looking to deny the claim, they're looking to find coverage over. There are exceptions to the rule. We're in a very, shall we say, liberal environment on policy interpretation. There's some hard lines, but overall, it's a very liberal interpretation. With property, they don't, the industry has a horrible reputation on paying claims. So adjuster comes out post loss. Homeowner isn't happy with the number they were received. They hire a third party adjuster, or they hire a contractor who comes in with a much higher value this is what it is going to cost you to replace and bring you whole again.
Yeah.
Carrier disagrees. The third party adjuster or contractor would often receive what they called was an assignment of benefits, and the insured's proceeds under that policy would go to that third party, who then theoretically were acting on behalf of the homeowner. In the statute, and this gets really, really technical. I never had to deal with it. In the statute, there was an element that if you went through the legal process and the final decision in the carrier's estimate for repairs was even $1 less than what the third party, the TPA or the contractor had come up with, the insurer not only had to pay that, they had to pay all the legal fees of the third party. It was a mill for the trial bar.
Yeah.
And there's talk, I think after maybe Hurricane Ian, there was a law firm that came in out of Louisiana up into the Panhandle, I believe, and were just churning claims, and they had their wrists slapped big time, and I think were barred from practicing in Florida.
Wow.
It was a money mill, and that has supposedly finally been fixed. And with tort reform, a lot of what came through was bodily injury this year, and it will help the auto market, whether it's personal lines or commercial lines. But when trial bar realized that DeSantis was signing it as soon as the statute was passed and not letting it hold to the end of the legislative session, you have the Morgan and Morgans, and there was another large trial attorney come out against it. I think that one of the two, literally prior to that taking effect, filed more claims in a 4-week period than they had for the entire year 2022. So all of it's going to have to work through the courts before we start to see relief.
Yeah. All right. Well, I got one more question, and I know we're going past time here, but I'm just going to ask you. We are thrilled to have you as part of the conversation as we think about this. If there is an industry or an association of experts or something that you think would benefit us in this conversation, let us know who they might be, and that we can invite them to the party. So you don't have to answer right now, but if you think about somebody, if there's a resource that this effort could benefit from, we certainly don't want to miss that opportunity to do that.
What I think we have, and I'm focused more on the professional side here. I can think of two of my carriers right off the bat that mine their claims data incredibly. And it might help you as you're looking at the building code to be able to identify where the claims are coming from.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with improving and bringing up the standard in the resiliency. But if you know where the claims are originating, waterproofing, waterproofing claims are, just skyrocketing. And then there's project types, that type of thing. But I absolutely could get somebody to come, 2 different carriers at different times. I'm absolutely sure they'd be happy to do a presentation to you.
Nice. We maybe could work something like that out then.
Okay.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Erinn.
Elizabeth, I'm standing down. No more questions from Monty.
Thank you, Monty. Appreciate it. I don't have a problem. I've been enjoying learning from Erinn. It's just I'm sure everybody has other things to run into, including Crystal and Becky. There is the 1 o'clock component call. So thank you so much, Erinn, for joining us. We'll reach out to you to try to get to organize the presentations from the 2 carriers you mentioned. And Krista will be reaching out to everybody to do the polls for our next subcommittee meeting and our whole committee meeting as well too.
Yes.
Thank you so much, all. Thank you for hanging there with us. Appreciate it. I'll see you all soon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.